Sometimes the living are more dead than those buried 6 feet under. Cole Brennan proved that every single morning for 3 years straight, riding through darkness to talk to a woman who couldn't hear him anymore. And here's the thing, nobody tells you about grief. It's comfortable. It's predictable. It becomes the only thing you know how to do, which is exactly why Cole needed it shattered. He just didn't know it yet. This is a story about a man who chose death over life until life gave him no choice at all. The Arizona Territory in 1887 wasn't a forgiving place. It was all dust and blood and men trying to carve something permanent out of land that killed the weak and humbled the strong. Out here, 30 miles from the nearest town, Cole Brennan's ranch sat like a scar on the desert floor. Functional, isolated, forgotten. The kind of place a man goes when he wants the world to stop asking questions. Every dawn, before the sun could shame him with its persistence, Cole would saddle his roan mare in darkness, so complete you could taste it. No lantern, no hesitation. His hands knew the leather and buckles like a blind man knows his own face. The horse knew the route so well she could have made it alone. And some mornings, Cole wondered if he was even there at all or just a ghost going through motions that didn't matter anymore. The ride took 17 minutes. Cole had counted. 17 minutes through scrub brush and creosote, past the dried creek bed that only ran 3 months a year, over the small rise where you could see the cottonwood tree, standing sentinel against the purple sky. 17 minutes to reach the only place that felt real anymore. Beneath that cottonwood, marked by a simple wooden cross and a headstone he'd carved himself, lay Sarah Brennan. Beloved wife, 28 years old, dead from fever, 3 years, 2 months, and 14 days ago. Not that Cole was counting, except he was. He counted every single one. He'd dismount the same way every time. Left foot first, a slight hesitation before his boots hit ground. Like part of him still hoped this was the morning he'd wake up and find the last 3 years had been the fever dream instead. Then he'd walk to the grave, drop to one knee in the dirt he'd worn smooth with this ritual, and talk. "Morning, Sarah. Brought you dessert marigolds today. Found them growing by the north pasture fence. You always loved the yellow ones." His voice in the pre-dawn silence sounded like something dredged from a well, hollow, echoing, desperate for something to fill it. He'd tell her about the ranch, about how the cattle were doing, about the fence that needed mending, about the ranch hand who quit last week without explanation. Surface things, safe things. Never about how the house smelled wrong without her, how he couldn't sleep in their bed anymore, how he'd started eating his meals standing at the kitchen window because sitting at the table meant facing her empty chair. Jensen's asking about expanding the herd. Thinks we should buy those 20 head from the Harrison place before someone else does. What do you think? He'd pause like she might actually answer. Like if he waited long enough in the quiet, he'd hear her voice telling him, yes, buy the cattle, or no, save the money, or Cole, you damn fool, stop talking to the dirt and live your life. But there was only silence and the wind moving through dried grass, and after 3 years even that pause had become part of the script. The sky would lighten while he talked, bleeding from black to deep blue to that particular shade of purple that only exists in the minutes before dawn breaks. Cole would watch it happen from beside Sarah's grave, and sometimes he'd think about how she'd loved sunrises, how she'd drag him out of bed to watch them, how she'd said every new day was a gift. He wondered what she'd think of him now, wasting every gift, refusing to unwrap a single one. His ranch hands had stopped trying to talk to him about it after the first year. Tommy, the youngest one, had made the mistake once of suggesting Cole might want to move forward or find some peace. Cole had stared at him with eyes so empty that Tommy actually took a step back, and he'd never mentioned it again. The other hands learned fast. You worked for Cole Brennan, you kept your head down, you didn't ask questions, and you definitely didn't comment on the fact that your boss was more ghost than man. The ranch ran on muscle memory and momentum. Cole did the work because work was what you did, not because he cared about the outcome. Fences got mended because fences needed mending. Cattle got moved because cattle needed moving. But there was no joy in it, no satisfaction, no sense of building toward anything. It was just time being filled until there was no more time to fill. His house reflected it. The place Sarah had made warm and lived in had slowly calcified into a museum of avoidance. He'd removed her things from the bedroom within a month. Couldn't bear seeing them. But he hadn't changed anything else. Her apron still hung on the kitchen hook. Her book, the one she'd been reading when the fever took her, remained on the side table with her ribbon bookmark at page 63. The photograph of their wedding day sat on the mantel, Sarah's face frozen in joy that felt like an accusation every time he looked at it. He didn't eat there anymore. Couldn't. He'd take his plate and stand at the window, chewing without tasting, staring out at land that went on forever and meant nothing. The dining table collected dust. The parlor stayed dark. The bedroom where she'd died remained closed, its door a boundary he wouldn't cross. He slept in the barn some nights or in the spare room, or sometimes not at all. What did it matter? 3 years of this. 3 years of dawn rides and one-sided conversations and going through motions that passed for living. 3 years of his ranch hands exchanging worried glances they thought he didn't see. 3 years of refusing invitations to town, to church socials, to anything that might require him to pretend he was a person instead of a walking wound. 3 years of everyone around him tiptoeing through life while he stood perfectly still, waiting for nothing, hoping for nothing, wanting nothing but to keep doing exactly what he was doing, until the earth took him too. And then came the morning. Everything broke. It started the same way. Darkness saddled the 17-minute ride. Cole's mind was on nothing in particular. Or maybe on everything in the way that thoughts blur together at 4:30 in the morning when you haven't slept right in years. The roan knew the path, her hooves finding purchase on ground she'd crossed 1,000 times. They approached the dried creek bed, the one that ran only during monsoon season, the one that was just a shallow ditch of sand and rock most of the year. Except this time, the horse balked. She stopped dead. Ears pinned back, head tossing. Cole, pulled from his fog, tightened the reins. "Easy, girl. It's the same creek it always is." But she wouldn't budge, kept sidestepping, snorting her displeasure at something Cole couldn't see in the darkness. He dismounted, annoyed at this disruption to his ritual, this crack in the routine that kept him functional. He took a step toward the creek bed. And that's when he saw it. A shape that didn't belong, something darker against the dark sand. His hand went instinctively to the rifle on his saddle, because out here, strange shapes in the dark could mean trouble of the human or animal variety, and neither was welcome. But as he got closer, as the pre-dawn light just barely started to separate shadow from substance, he realized it was a person, a woman, lying partially in the shallow trickle of water that remained from last week's rare rain, motionless as death itself. Cole's first thought, and God forgive him for it, was to leave. To mount his horse, continue to the grave, and pretend he'd seen nothing. He'd used up all his capacity to care 3 years ago. He had nothing left to give anyone, and whatever this woman's story was, it wasn't his problem. The territory was full of hard luck stories. You couldn't save them all. You couldn't save any of them. He actually turned to go, got 3 steps back toward his horse. But something, maybe the last shred of the man he used to be, or maybe just the muscle memory of decency, made him stop. Sarah's voice in his head. Not the dead Sarah he talked to every morning, but the living Sarah who'd once found an injured coyote and insisted they try to help it despite the danger. "Cole Brennan, you don't get to choose who deserves saving," he cursed under his breath, low and vicious, and walked back. Up close, he could see she was Apache. The style of her hair, the beadwork on what remained of her torn dress. Young, maybe 30, unconscious, and burning up with fever so intense he could feel the heat radiating from her skin before he even touched her. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, her lips cracked from dehydration. A small bundle of possessions lay beside her, carefully tied despite whatever catastrophe had brought her here. Cole knelt in the sand, his knee finding the same position it took every morning at a different woman's side, and for a moment he felt the absurdity of it all crash over him. Here he was, talking to the dead every day while the living collapsed in the dirt around him. He checked for wounds, none that he could see. Just fever, dehydration, exposure. She'd been traveling, that much was clear, and whatever she was running from or toward had nearly killed her. Her skin was paper dry, despite the fever, her pulse thready beneath his fingers. Without water, without shelter, she'd be dead by full sunrise. The smart thing would be to ride to his nearest neighbor, 12 miles east, and let them handle it, or ride to town, get the doctor, bring help. The smart thing was definitely not to take a dying Apache woman to his ranch, to bring a stranger into the house he'd locked away from the world, to disrupt the careful death in life he'd constructed for himself. But Cole Brennan hadn't done the smart thing in 3 years. So why start now? He lifted her. She weighed almost nothing, all bone and determination, and carried her to his horse. The roan, bless her steady heart, stood calm while he maneuvered the unconscious woman into position. The ride back to the ranch took 33 minutes instead of 17, Cole moving carefully over rough ground, the woman's fevered heat pressing against his chest like accusation. For the first time in 3 years, he didn't visit Sarah's grave at dawn. The ranch house loomed in the growing light, suddenly unfamiliar. Cole hadn't brought another person here since the funeral. His hands knew how to be alone in this space, how to move through rooms without disturbing their emptiness. Now he stood at his own front door like a stranger, this dying woman in his arms, and realized he'd have to figure out how to be human again. He pushed through the door, stood in the dim hallway. The bedroom where Sarah died was to the left. He couldn't go in there, wouldn't go in there. The spare room was to the right, small and unused, filled with nothing but dust and a narrow bed. He turned right. The woman needed to be cooled down, and fast. Fever this high could cook a brain, shut down a body. Cole laid her on the spare room floor, couldn't trust his shaking hands to get her on the bed without dropping her, and went to pump water, to find cloths, to remember how to care for something living. His hands shook as he wrung out the cool cloths, as he pressed them to her forehead, her neck, her wrists. When was the last time he'd touched another person? Really touched them, with intention and care. He couldn't remember. The ranch hands kept their distance. He kept his distance. Everyone kept their distance from the walking dead man. But here was this woman, forcing him to remember, forcing him to act, forcing him to care whether someone lived or died. She murmured in fever dreams, words in a language he didn't understand, and he found himself talking back to her the way he talked to Sarah, telling her to hold on, to fight. That help was coming, even though help was just him, and he had no idea what he was doing. He changed the cloths every few minutes, trying to bring down the fever that seemed determined to consume her from the inside. Hours passed. The sun rose fully, marking the first dawn in 3 years that Cole hadn't greeted from beside his wife's grave. He should have felt guilty about that, should have felt the weight of the broken ritual. But all he felt was the strange urgency of keeping this stranger alive. It was the first thing that had mattered in so long that he'd forgotten what mattering felt like. By midday, the fever had dropped slightly. Not enough, but enough to mean she might survive. Cole sat on the floor beside her, his back against the wall, exhausted, in a way that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. The house felt different with another person in it, even an unconscious one. The silence was different. The shadows were different. Everything was different. He looked at her face, peaceful in unconsciousness despite the fever, and wondered who she was, where she was going, what she was running from, whether she had people looking for her, mourning her, counting the days since she'd disappeared, whether she'd thank him for saving her or curse him for it. And for the first time in 3 years, Cole Brennan wondered if he'd made the right choice. Not about saving her. That had been instinct, the last ember of the man he used to be. But about everything else. About the 3 years of dawn rides and one-sided conversations. About choosing to live in the past, because the present was too sharp to touch. About becoming so comfortable with grief that he'd forgotten there was anything else. This woman, whoever she was, had shattered his routine. His careful, predictable, safe routine that kept him from feeling anything too deeply. And now here he was, sitting on the floor of a room he never used, watching over a stranger who might die anyway, feeling something dangerously close to hope that she wouldn't. The question was simple, even if the answer wasn't. When you've spent 3 years teaching yourself not to care, what do you do when suddenly you have no choice? Cole didn't know, but as the afternoon sun slanted through the window and the woman's breathing slowly began to steady, he realized he was about to find out. She opened her eyes on the 3rd day, and the first thing she did was try to kill him. Cole had been dozing in the chair he'd dragged into the room, 3 days of broken sleep finally catching up with him, when he heard the rustle of movement. His eyes snapped open just in time to see her sitting up, a shard of broken pottery from the water basin clutched in her hand like a knife, her eyes wild with fever and fear and the kind of desperation that makes people dangerous. She lunged before he could speak, before he could raise his hands, before he could tell her she was safe. Though God knows safe was a relative term when you were an Apache woman waking up in a white man's house with no memory of how you got there. He caught her wrist. Barely. She was weak from the fever, but fighting with everything she had left, which wasn't much but was enough to draw blood when the pottery shard grazed his forearm. They struggled for maybe 10 seconds that felt like 10 minutes, her gasping with effort, him trying not to hurt her, while also trying not to get stabbed, until finally, her strength gave out and she collapsed back onto the bed, chest heaving, eyes still locked on his with the wariness of a trapped animal. "Easy," Cole said, hands up, backing toward the door. "You're safe. You were sick. I found you by the creek. You're safe." She didn't believe him. He could see it in every line of her body, tensed to fight or flee the moment she had the strength for either. Her eyes tracked his every movement, calculating distances, looking for weapons, for exits, for any advantage she could find. Smart. Out here. Trust. Got you killed. "My name's Cole Brennan. This is my ranch. You've been unconscious for 3 days with fever. I've been trying to keep you alive." He gestured to the water basin, the pile of used cloths, the broth he'd tried to get down her throat when she was delirious. Evidence of care, though he knew evidence meant nothing to someone who'd learned the hard way that intentions and actions rarely matched. She spoke then, her voice raw as desert wind. Why? It was the question Cole had been asking himself for 3 days. Why had he brought her here? Why had he stayed up nights changing fever cloths when he could have ridden for help? Why had he cared whether a stranger lived or died when he'd stopped caring about his own life years ago? "I don't know," he said, and it was the most honest answer he'd given anyone in 3 years. Something in his face must have convinced her, or maybe she was just too weak to maintain the suspicion. Either way, she lowered the pottery shard, though she didn't let it go. "Where are my things?" He pointed to the corner where he'd placed her carefully tied bundle. "Untouched. Everything's there. I didn't look through it." She studied him for a long moment, then gave the smallest nod. Not trust, not yet, but maybe the first step toward not killing him in his sleep. It was a start. "What's your name?" Cole asked. Another long pause, like she was deciding whether a name was information or ammunition. Finally, "Ayita." "Ayita," he repeated, testing the shape of it. "You need to rest. The fever's down, but you're still weak. There's broth if you can eat, water if you can drink. I'll be outside if you need anything." He left before she could respond, pulling the door mostly closed behind him, giving her the privacy to feel vulnerable without an audience. His arm was bleeding where she'd cut him, not deep, but enough to need attention. He wrapped it with a strip of cloth in the kitchen, and tried not to think about how alive he'd felt in those 10 seconds of struggle, how the adrenaline had reminded him that his heart still knew how to pound, his reflexes still knew how to react, his body still knew it wanted to survive. 3 years of sleepwalking, and it took almost getting stabbed to wake him up. Sarah would have laughed at the irony. The next morning, he found Ayita in his kitchen. She'd made her way out of the spare room under her own power, though she was using the wall for support, her legs still unsteady beneath her. She was standing at the basin, washing the dishes Cole had let pile up for 3 days, or maybe 3 weeks. He'd lost track. Her movements were slow but deliberate, like she was proving something to herself or to him or to the universe that had tried to kill her. "You should be resting," Cole said from the doorway. "I've rested enough." She didn't turn around, kept scrubbing at a plate that was already clean. "I don't take charity I can't repay." Pride. Cole understood that. He lived on nothing but pride and routine, and at least pride was something you could hold on to when everything else had been taken. "You almost died. You don't owe me anything. That's not how it works." She finally turned to face him, and in the morning light, he could see her properly, for the first time. Angular features, eyes that had seen too much too young. A scar along her jawline that spoke of old violence survived. She was beautiful in the way a knife is beautiful, sharp, dangerous, made for cutting through soft things. "Out here, everything is debt and payment. You saved my life. Now I owe you until the scales balance." Cole wanted to argue, wanted to tell her she could leave any time, that he'd done what any decent person would do, that he didn't want her gratitude or her labor or anything else that required him to interact with another human being. But the words died in his throat because the truth was, having someone else in the house had made the silence less suffocating. Having someone else's problems to focus on had made his own seem smaller. Having someone to keep alive had given him a reason to get out of bed that wasn't just habit. So instead he said, "The coffee's on the stove. It's probably terrible. I've gotten used to it, but you might want to skip it." The ghost of a smile touched her mouth. Not quite a smile, really. More like the memory of what a smile used to feel like. "I've had worse." They drank terrible coffee together as the sun rose, not talking, not looking at each other, 2 damaged people occupying the same space and pretending it meant nothing. But it meant something. Cole knew it meant something even if he couldn't name what yet. Days passed. Strange days, awkward days, days where the routines Cole had built around his grief kept bumping into the reality of another person in his space. Ayita moved through the house like water, finding new channels, cleaning without asking, cooking without commenting on his bare cupboards, existing in parallel to him, rather than intersecting. She respected his silences. She didn't ask about the photograph on the mantel, or why there was a room with a closed door he never entered, or why he sometimes stopped mid-sentence and stared at nothing for long minutes. She was good at not asking questions, which made Cole wonder what questions she was avoiding answering. On the 5th day, he came in from checking fences to find her standing in front of Sarah's photograph, so still she might have been carved from stone. He froze in the doorway, a spike of something hot and sharp driving through his chest. Anger, grief, territorial fury at this stranger, looking at the one thing he had left of the woman he'd loved. But Ayita just said, quiet as prayer, she was beautiful, and walked away. No questions about how she died. No platitudes about time healing wounds. No sympathy that would have felt like pity. Just acknowledgement that Sarah had existed, had been beautiful, had mattered. Cole stood alone in front of the photograph for a long time after that, seeing Sarah's face like he hadn't really seen it in years. Not as a symbol of everything he'd lost, but as a person who'd lived and loved and laughed and died. A person, not a shrine. That night, for the first time since Sarah's death, he ate dinner at the table, instead of standing at the window. Ayita sat across from him, the space between them measured and careful, and they ate in silence that felt less empty than usual. The change wasn't sudden, it was incremental, almost invisible, like water wearing away stone. Cole started talking while they worked side by side. Small things at first. Observations about the weather or the ranch or nothing in particular. Ayita would listen, sometimes responding with a word or two, sometimes just a nod, her silence companionable rather than cold. She didn't perform interest. She didn't fill empty air with empty words. She just existed alongside him, and somehow that was enough. One morning, and Cole couldn't say exactly when this started, she joined him on his dawn ride. Not to the grave. He still hadn't gone back to the grave. Couldn't face the guilt of that broken ritual, even though he knew Sarah wouldn't care. Even though the whole point of the ritual had been his grief, not her memory. Instead, they rode the property line, checking fence, watching the sun transform the desert from gray to gold. Two people who'd forgotten how to be people, learning the basics again. Their silences became conversations without words, a glance that meant rain coming, a shift in posture that meant coyotes near the herd, a shared breath when a hawk took flight so close they could hear the wind in its feathers. Cole found himself looking forward to these rides, to this quiet communion with someone who understood that not everything needed to be spoken. But understanding has weight, and weight eventually becomes too heavy to carry alone. It happened 2 weeks after he'd found her, during an evening rainstorm that turned the desert briefly green and made the air smell like possibility. They were sitting on the porch watching lightning write violence across the sky when Ayita finally spoke the words she'd been carrying. My husband died 8 weeks ago, my son 3 days after him. Same fever that nearly took me. Her voice was steady, factual, like she was reporting weather, but Cole heard the fracture underneath, the place where steady met shattered and learned to coexist. I couldn't save either of them. I held them while they burned, and there was nothing I could do, nothing any of us could do. She didn't cry. Cole suspected she'd run out of tears the same way he had. That grief this deep happened in some dry country beyond crying. She just stared out at the rain, and Cole understood with sudden, terrible clarity why she'd been wandering alone in the desert, why she'd collapsed by that creek, why part of her probably hadn't wanted him to save her. I'm sorry, he said, and meant it, and knew how inadequate those words were. Don't be sorry. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and he saw his own pain reflected back. You understand. That's different. And God help him. He did understand. He understood the way grief became the air you breathed, the way it shaped every thought and action, the way it made you a stranger to yourself. He understood the guilt of surviving when the people you loved didn't. He understood the exhaustion of pretending to be whole when you were just pieces held together by will. So he told her. Told her about Sarah, about the fever that took her in 3 days, about how he'd ridden 20 miles to get the doctor who arrived too late, about how he'd buried her under the cottonwood because she'd loved that tree, about how he'd been dying by inches ever since, because he didn't know how else to honor her memory except to stop living himself. He told her things he'd never said out loud. Not to the ranch hands, not to Sarah's family, not even to Sarah's grave during those 3 years of dawn confessions. He told a stranger the truth he'd been hiding from himself, that he was angry, furious, enraged at Sarah for dying, at God for taking her, at himself for failing to save her, at the world for continuing to spin when his had stopped. I know, Ayita said simply. Not I'm sorry. Not she's in a better place. Not time will heal. Just I know. And those 2 words held more comfort than 1,000 pretty lies. They sat in the darkness while the rain fell and the lightning illuminated their faces in brief, stark flashes. 2 people who'd lost everything, learning that sometimes the only thing worse than being alone with your grief is realizing you're not alone at all. The storm passed. The stars came out. Neither of them moved. And in that stillness, something shifted. Not healing. Grief doesn't heal, it just changes shape. But maybe the first recognition that they didn't have to carry it alone. That 2 people could sit in the same darkness and make it a little less dark just by being there. When Cole finally spoke again, his voice was rough. I haven't been to her grave since I found you. First time in 3 years I've missed it. I keep thinking I should feel guilty about that. Do you? He considered it honestly. No, and that scares me. Ayita turned to face him, her expression unreadable in the starlight. The dead don't count days, Cole. They don't need our rituals. We do. And maybe you don't need that ritual anymore. It was the truth he'd been avoiding. The possibility that terrified him more than anything. That he could stop visiting Sarah's grave every morning and she'd still be dead and he'd still be alive and the world would keep turning. That his grief could change shape without dishonoring her memory. That he could want something beyond just surviving. That he already did want something, and she was sitting right next to him. The realization hit him like lightning, not sudden, because it had been building for weeks, but illuminating. He wanted Ayita to stay, not as repayment for saving her life, not as cheap replacement for what he'd lost, but because she'd shown him something he'd forgotten. The 2 broken things could lean against each other and somehow both stand a little straighter. But wanting something meant risking loss, and Cole had already lost everything once. Could he survive losing it again? Before he could figure out how to ask her to stay, before he could find words for something he barely understood himself, Ayita stood, stretched, said goodnight, walked inside, left him alone with the question he hadn't asked and the fear he couldn't name. The next morning, Cole woke to find her packing. She had her bundle retied, her few possessions arranged with the careful efficiency of someone who'd learned to travel light. She was dressed for the road, her hair braided back, her face set in that expression of careful neutrality that meant she'd already made a decision and wouldn't be talked out of it. You're leaving. It wasn't a question. I'm strong enough now. She didn't look at him. kept her hands busy with knots that were already tight. "You saved my life. I've repaid what I can. Time to move on." Cole wanted to argue, wanted to tell her she didn't have to go, that she could stay as long as she needed, that he needed her to stay even if he couldn't articulate why. But 3 years of not fighting for anything had atrophied those muscles. 3 years of letting everything slip away had taught him how to watch people leave without trying to stop them. So he just nodded, said, "I'll saddle you a horse. You'll make better time." Something flickered across her face. Disappointment, maybe, or relief, or both. She nodded back. They didn't speak as Cole prepared the mare, as Aida checked her bundle one last time, as the sun rose on what might be the last morning they'd share. The silence that had felt companionable now felt like a wall, solid and impassable, built from all the things neither of them knew how to say. She mounted, settled herself in the saddle, looked down at him with eyes that held too much and said nothing at all. "Thank you," she said finally, "for everything." Cole wanted to scream, wanted to beg, wanted to do anything except stand there like a statue while another person he cared about rode out of his life. But instead, he just touched the brim of his hat and stepped back, giving her room to leave. She rode down the path toward the road, her back straight, her pace steady. Cole watched until she was a silhouette, then a shadow, then just a memory of movement against the desert morning. Then he saddled his own horse and rode to Sarah's grave for the first time in 2 weeks, because apparently some rituals were easier than fighting for what you actually wanted. Here's what nobody tells you about letting go. It's not one decision, it's 1,000 small ones, and the hardest part isn't choosing to hold on or move forward. It's figuring out if you even have the right to choose at all. Cole knelt beside Sarah's grave for the first time in 2 weeks, and the words he'd said 1,000 times before caught in his throat, like dust. The script was gone. The ritual felt hollow. He opened his mouth to tell her about the ranch, about the weather, about nothing that mattered, and realized he had nothing to say, because for the first time in 3 years, the only conversation that mattered was the one he'd failed to have with someone still breathing. What do you do when you finally wake up and realize you've been choosing death over life, only to discover that life already walked away while you were deciding? Cole stared at his wife's name, carved in wood and stone, and understood with brutal clarity that he'd been using her memory as a shield against living, not to honor her, to hide from the terrifying possibility that he could love something again and lose it just as completely. Sarah hadn't asked him to spend 3 years dying by inches at her grave. He'd chosen that, and now Aida was riding away because he'd been too afraid to choose differently. The question was simple, even if everything else was complicated. Was he going to let fear write the rest of his story? Or was he finally going to fight for something that scared him? Cole stood, brushed the dirt from his knees, looked at Sarah's grave, and spoke the truth for the first time since she'd died. "I'll always love you. Nothing changes that. But I'm still here, Sarah. I'm still breathing and bleeding and trying to figure out what that means. And I met someone who understands the shape of this grief, who doesn't need me to be anything except honest about how broken I am. I think you'd like her. I think you'd tell me I'm a damn fool for letting her leave without a fight." His voice cracked on the last words, 3 years of unspoken truth finally breaking through. "I'm tired. I'm so tired of surviving instead of living, and I don't know if I'm allowed to want more than this. If it's betraying your memory to admit that maybe grief doesn't have to be the only thing that defines me. But I think I have to try. I think if you were here, you'd kick my ass for wasting 3 years talking to dirt instead of living the life you fought so hard to keep." The wind moved through the cottonwood branches, and Cole chose to believe it sounded like permission. He rode after her, not the desperate gallop of a man chasing salvation, but the steady pace of someone who'd finally decided that wanting something was worth the risk of losing it. The mare's hoofbeats were his heartbeat, both of them loud enough to drown out the voice in his head that whispered all the ways this could go wrong, all the reasons he should turn back, all the fear that had kept him paralyzed for 3 years. He found her a mile down the road, just sitting there beside her pack, the horse grazing nearby. Ayita herself still as stone with her arms wrapped around her knees, not moving forward, not moving back. Just stopped, like she'd run out of direction and was waiting for the world to tell her which way to go. Cole dismounted slowly, giving her time to hear him coming, to decide whether she wanted to face him or ride away. She didn't move, didn't turn around, just spoke to the empty road ahead of her. I couldn't decide where to go. Every direction felt wrong, every town I could think of, every place I might go. None of it felt like moving forward. It all felt like running. I know the feeling. Cole walked until he was beside her. Not too close, respecting the space grief required. I've been running for 3 years. Just did it by standing still. She looked up at him then, and her eyes held the same question his heart was asking. What if trying again just means failing again? What if opening up just means more breaking? But she didn't voice it. Instead, she asked, "Why are you here, Cole?" It was the question everything hinged on, and Cole had never been good with words, had spent 3 years avoiding any conversation that required him to be vulnerable. But Ayita deserved honesty, even if honesty came out clumsy and incomplete. Especially then. Because I'm tired of standing still while life passes me by. Because you're the first person in 3 years who made me want to do something besides survive. Because grief doesn't disappear when you find someone who understands it. It just becomes something you can carry together instead of alone. He swallowed hard, forced himself to keep going. Because I'm asking you to stay, not to replace anything, not to fix anything. Just stay, see what that looks like. The silence stretched between them, loaded with all the weight of 2 people who'd lost everything, learning whether they were brave enough to risk anything again. Ayita studied his face like she was reading a map to somewhere she wasn't sure she wanted to go. I'm still grieving, she said finally. It doesn't just stop because I met someone who understands. Some days I wake up and the weight of it is so heavy I can barely breathe. Some days I forget they're gone for just a second, and then I remember, and it's like losing them all over again. That doesn't change. I know. It won't go away. This isn't a story where love heals all wounds and we ride off into some sunset, where the past doesn't matter anymore. The past always matters. The grief always exists. I know. Cole's voice was steady now, certain in a way he hadn't felt in years. I'm not asking you to be healed. I'm not asking you to forget or move on or any of that bullshit people say when they don't understand, that grief becomes part of you. I'm just asking if you want to stop running, because I'm done standing still, and maybe we could figure out what comes next together. No promises except honesty. No expectations except showing up. Just 2 people who understand that you can hold grief in one hand and possibility in the other. Ayita closed her eyes and Cole watched her face cycle through every emotion he'd felt at Sarah's grave. Fear, longing, guilt, hope. The terrible recognition that wanting something new didn't erase what you'd lost. But it didn't dishonor it either. When she opened her eyes again, they were wet, but clear. I don't know if I remember how to do this, how to be with someone, how to let someone in, how to risk caring when caring has only ever led to losing. Neither do I, Cole admitted, but maybe that's okay. Maybe we figure it out as we go. She looked at him for a long moment, and Cole felt the weight of that gaze, measuring everything he was and everything he wasn't. All the broken pieces and sharp edges, all the grief that would never fully fade and the tentative hope that scared them both. Then slowly, so slowly he almost didn't notice it happening, she nodded. Not a promise, not a declaration, just a small movement that meant yes, maybe. Let's try. Cole exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding and held out his hand. Aida looked at it like it was both the most natural thing in the world and the most terrifying, then placed her hand in his. Her palm was warm and rough with calluses. Real and present and alive. They rode back to the ranch together, side by side, not talking about what came next because neither of them knew. The only certainty was the choice to try, and sometimes that's enough. Life didn't transform overnight. It never does. Cole still had mornings where the grief hit him like a physical blow, where he woke up reaching for someone who wasn't there and had to remember all over again that some losses never stop hurting. Aida still had days where she'd go quiet for hours, lost in memories of faces that only she could see, mourning a future that had died with her husband and son. But they learned to carry it together. Learn that you could honor the dead without living like a ghost yourself. Learn that two people could sit in the same darkness and somehow make it survivable. New routines formed slowly, carefully, built on honesty rather than avoidance. Morning rides together, not to a grave, but to watch the day begin. Working side by side with a companionship that didn't require constant words. Sitting on the porch as evening fell, their silhouettes close but not quite touching. Two people learning that proximity was its own kind of healing. And yes, Cole still visited Sarah's grave, but now Aida walked with him sometimes. She didn't speak, didn't intrude, just stood nearby with her own understanding of loss, while Cole talked to his wife's memory about the life he was building. The woman who'd shown him that hearts can hold more than one truth. Aida never felt like a replacement because she wasn't trying to fill Sarah's space. She was carving out her own, and somehow there was room for both. They were sitting on the porch one evening, 6 months after that morning on the road, when Aida reached over and took Cole's hand. Just laced her fingers through his, casual as breathing, like it was something they did all the time, even though they didn't. Cole looked down at their joined hands, his scarred and weathered, hers strong and steady, and felt something in his chest that wasn't grief, wasn't fear, wasn't the comfortable numbness he'd lived in for 3 years. It was hope, fragile and terrifying and real. "Thank you," Aida said quietly, "for coming after me." "Thank you," Cole replied, "for staying." The sun set behind them, painting the desert in shades of gold and purple and red, and two people who'd spent years teaching themselves not to hope sat together and chose to try anyway. Not because the grief was gone. Not because the past didn't matter, but because they'd learned that you can honor what you've lost while still reaching for what you might find. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let yourself want something again, even knowing you might lose it. Sometimes survival means more than just breathing. It means choosing to live. Cole Brennan learned that in the space between one dawn and the next, in the moment he stopped talking to the dead and started fighting for the living. It didn't erase the 3 years he'd lost or bring back the woman he'd loved or make the grief disappear. But it gave him something he thought he'd never have again. A reason to see what tomorrow looked like. And that was enough. Now here's my question for you. What would you fight for if you knew you might lose it anyway? Drop your answer in the comments below. And if this story reminded you that grief and hope can exist in the same heart, that healing doesn't mean forgetting, that it's never too late to choose life over survival, hit that subscribe button, because there are more stories like this waiting. Stories about people who found the courage to reach for something new, even when the past still had teeth. What are you waiting for? Your next story is just one click away.